Good morning friends, welcome back to Parnika tutorials. In the last video, I have discussed the 4 strategies to handle the deadlock such as deadlock ignorance, deadlock prevention, deadlock avoidance and deadlock detection and recovery. I hope you have watched that video. If you did not watch that video or if you don't know that concept, I request you to go back and watch that video and come back to this video. In this video, I want to discuss in detail about the deadlock prevention. So I request everyone to watch the complete video for better understanding. Now, what are the 4 necessary conditions a deadlock can happen? The 4 conditions are mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption and circular wait. Now, if these 4 conditions are satisfied, then only we will say that there is a deadlock. Now, if we disable any one of the necessary condition, then deadlock will not happen. Is it clear? Suppose let's take that if I disable the mutual exclusion, then sharing is allowed. Now if sharing is allowed, then there is no deadlock at all. Similarly, hold and wait. If I disable the hold and wait, meaning is that request all resources initially, then also there is no deadlock. So we will discuss, can we disable the mutual exclusion condition? Can we exclude the hold and wait? If we exclude the hold and wait, what is the problems we will face? All these things I will discuss in detail for you. Now first let me discuss about the mutual exclusion. Then we will discuss if I disable the mutual exclusion condition, what will happen. Let's take that you have a resource R1 and you have 1 unit of resource R1. Now if you have 1 unit of resource R1, either you can allocate to the process P1 or process P2 or process P3. Is it clear? Are you able to understand it or not? Meaning is that if you have 1 unit of resource R1, any one process can use it at any instant of time. Is it clear? So that one we will call it as a mutual exclusion. Meaning is that, let me take, a printer is there. If you have a single printer, any one person can take the printout. Let's take that person P1, person P2, person P3 is there. Any one person can take the printout. Is it clear? So that is what the mutual exclusion. If we disable the mutual exclusion concept, what is the meaning? You are allowing the resource to share among the multiple processes. Let's take that printer is non-resourceable, means not shareable resource, but however you have allowed to share. Then what will happen? Person P1 while he is printing, person P2 is allowed to print and person 3 is also allowed to print. Then what will happen? There will be a lot of confusion. What it will do? It will print one page of the person P1, one page of the person P2, then one page of person P3. Like that it will happen. Is it clear? So there will be a lot of confusion. So few resources will be there. Those resources we cannot share among the multiple processes. So we cannot disable the mutual exclusion in practical. Is it clear? So if we can disable the mutual exclusion, then deadlock will not happen, but disabling the mutual exclusion is not a correct solution. Are you able to understand? Now we will see, can we disable the hold and wait condition or not? Now what is meant by hold and wait? Let's take that 2 resources are there such as R1 and R2 of 1 unit. Is it clear? You have 2 processes P1 and P2 and you have 2 resources R1 and R2. Now let's take that resource R1 has been allocated to the process P1 and process P1 is requesting for the resource R2. So R1 resource has been allocated and process P1 is requesting for the resource R2. At the same time, resource R2 has been allocated with the process P2 and process P2 is waiting for the resource R1. So process P1 is holding the resource R1 and waiting for the resource R2. Similarly, process P2 is holding the resource R2 and then waiting for the resource R1. So when it is waiting for the resource R2, it should not release the resource R1. Am I right? It has to hold and wait for the other resource. Is it clear? If we disable the hold and wait, meaning is that request all the resources initially, meaning is that process P1, if it wants to complete its task, it needs the resource R1 and resource R2. If the resource R1 and resource R2 both are available, then take both the resources and perform your task and then release your resources. See, any process usually request for a resource. Once it got the resource, it will use the resource and then it will release the resource. Is it clear? So if a particular process want to complete a task, it needs both the resource R1 and R2. If both the resources are available, then only you take both the resources and perform your task, then you release it. But here what is happening, resource R1 is with the free. Is it clear? Resource R1 is free. However, resource R2 is with the process P2. So in that case, what the process P1 has to do, as it need both R1 and R2, R2 is not free. It should not hold the resource R1, or it should not take the resource R1 at all. If process P1 does not take the resource R1 at all, then process P2 will take it and it will complete the task. Then process P2 will release both the R1 and R2. Then process P1 can perform its task. I will discuss with another example. Is it clear? Now let's take that. One TV is there in a home and husband want to watch the IPL and wife want to watch the serial. Is it clear? Now let's take that. If you have a single TV, you will have a remote. In that remote, you will have the battery. Now let's take that. Husband has holding the remote and waiting for the battery, and wife is holding the battery and waiting for the remote. Am I right? Now if we keep disable the hold and wait, meaning is that request all resources initially. So there is a remote and there is a battery. Now if husband want to take the remote, he should check whether the battery is available or not. If remote and battery both are available, then only husband has to take it. Similarly, wife also, before taking the battery, she need to check whether the remote is also available or not. So whatever the resources you want initially take or request for all the resources, if all the requests can be granted, then you take them and perform your task, then release it. See, is it clear? So, but what is the problem with this one? A process, but here husband and wife know that they need remote and battery, but in reality a process does not know what are the future resources it needs. Am I right or wrong? Is it clear? So this is also not practically possible. Is it clear? Now we will discuss about no preemption. What is meant by no preemption? Let's take that process P1 is having the resource R1 and then it is waiting for the resource R2. Similarly, process P2 is having the resource R2 and resource R1. Now, a particular resource is with a process, then no preemption. No one should forcibly take the resource from the particular process. This is called as no preemption. If you disable it, meaning is that you are allowed to take the resource away from a particular process. If you are doing it, then it will degrade the system performance. How? I will tell you with an example. Let's take that a printer is there. Now, a particular process is printing some document or able to understand or performing something. Now, the person P1 had to take 100 pages of the document printout. Now he has taken the 50 pages, then someone or operating system has preempted it, means it has forcibly taken the printer from the person P1. Then what will happen? Now person P1 cannot print remaining 50 pages of the printout. Is it clear? So no preemption if you disable, take resource away is possible. But if you take the resources from a particular process forcefully, it leads the system degrade, means performance of the system will be degraded. Is it clear? So this is also not practically possible. Now we will discuss about the circular wait. What is meant by circular wait? Process P1 is waiting for the process P2. Process P2 is waiting for the process P1. So there is a circular. Is it clear? Now let me discuss with a simple concept for you. Let's take that three processes are there, P1, P2, P3, and you have three resources R1, R2, R3. Is it clear? Now resource R1 is with the process P1 and process P1 is requesting for the resource R2. Now resource R2 is with the process P2 and process P2 is requesting for the resource R3. Similarly, resource R3 is with the process P1 and process P3 is requesting for the resource R1. So, if process P1 wants to complete its task, it needs both the resources such as R1 and R2. However, R1 has been allocated but it is requesting for the R2, but the R2 is with the process P2. Similarly, process P2, if it wants to complete its task, it needs both the resources R2 and R3. But R2 is with it, but R3 is with the process P3. Similarly, process P3 wants to complete its task. Now, it needs both the R3 and R1. However, R3 is with the process P3, but it is waiting for the resource R1. Is it clear? So, the process P1 is waiting for the resource R2. That resource R2 is with the process P2. So, process P1 is waiting for the process P2 to release the resource R2. Similarly, process P2 needs the resource R3. That resource is with the process P3. So, process P2 is waiting for the process P3 to release the resource R3. Similarly, process P3 is waiting for the process P1 to release the resource R1. So, process P1 is waiting for process P2, process P2 is waiting for process P3, process P3 is waiting for process P1. So, it is circular wait. Now, if you want to disable the circular wait, if you successfully disable the circular wait, then there is no deadlock. Am I right or wrong? Because these are the 4 necessary conditions. If you disable any one condition, deadlock will not happen. Is it clear? Now, how can we disable the circular wait concept is, the resources what we will do, we will order the resources numerically. Meaning is that, let's take that you have 3 resources X, Y, Z. You need to make it number 1, resource 1, resource 2, resource 3 like that. Is it clear? Resource 4, resource 5 like that. You need to order them numerically. Is it clear? So, this is the example. And one more thing here is that, let's take that process P2 have the resource R2. Am I right? In this example, resource R2 has been allocated to the process P2. Now, if process P2 wants another resource, that resource should be more than the whatever the resource currently it is having. Suppose let's take that resource R2 is having, means is with the process P2. Now process P2 can request for resource R3, resource R4, resource R5, so on. However, it cannot request for the R1. Is it clear? Similarly, let's take that another example. Process P3 has the resource R3. Now, process P3 can request for the resource R5, resource R4, R5, R6, so on. However, it cannot. Process P3 cannot request for the resource number R1, resource number R2. If you keep such restriction, circular wait is not possible. How? If you look at here, why this circular wait is happened? Process P3 has the resource R3 and it is wanting the resource R1. Is it clear? So, if we disable this one, because in this restriction, process P3 can request for resource R4, resource R5 or resource R6, but it cannot request the resource R1. So, if process P1 is waiting for the process P2 is waiting for process P3, but process P3 is not waiting for the process P1. So, there is no circular. So, we have disabled the circular wait. If we disable the circular wait, deadlock can be preempted. Is it clear? So, this one, disabling the circular wait is practically possible. I hope you have understood. Now, you can ask me, sir, how it is practically possible? Meaning is that I will tell you. Now, let's take that in this scenario, if process P3 want to complete its task, it needs the resource R1 and resource R3. Is it clear? So, first it need to take the resource R1, then only it can take the resource R3. Am I right or wrong? If it has taken the resource R3, it cannot request for the resource R1. So, what is the order of the request for the process P3 is, first you take the R1, then R3. Now, if R1 is not with the free, meaning is that R1 is with the process P1. So now R1 is not free. Then obviously it cannot take the resource R3. That resource R3 process P2 will use and it will complete its task. So there is no deadlock. So this is the way we can disable the circular wait and preempt the deadlock. I hope you have understood how can we preempt the deadlock. If you still have any doubts related to this concept, feel free to ask me in the comment section. I will try to clear your doubts as early as possible. Thank you for watching the complete video. Have a nice day.